Welcome again to this workshop. We're gathered different experts from different nationalities, but what's joining us together here is the world of oyster restoration, flat oysters. And so this event is framed within the ocean decade. So just to have like a very brief introduction of what the ocean decade is, better than me saying what it is, I'd rather get you the video from the Ocean Decade website. So let me start sharing this screen. I hope you can see it.
The next 10 years will be crucial for life on the planet as we know it. Climate change, food shortages, epidemics and disasters, economic crises and unemployment. The good news? We can rely on a powerful source of common solutions to overcome these challenges. Our one shared ocean. Set to become the world's 7th largest economy by 2030, our ocean regulates climate and provides food and livelihoods for over 3 billion people. But do we know all our ocean has to offer? Can we harness ocean solutions to achieve our global goals by 2030? The United Nations Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development brings together scientists, governments, business, philanthropists and NGOs to unlock the science we need for the future we want. Are you ready to join the movement? Find out more www.oceandecade.org.
Okay, so are we ready to join the Ocean Decade, and are we ready to learn about oysters today? And so what I'm gonna do is, my name is Galimany and I work at the Institute of Marine Sciences. I have a background in studying bivalves from different areas of the world, physiology, histopathology, and like different areas. And now I'm very happy to start this round of different talks. What I'm gonna do is just call the speaker, and then each speaker is gonna introduce herself or himself and let us know about this wonderful world of flat oysters. And so we're starting the agenda today with, that was Boze or Hein? Now I'm a little bit lost. There we go, Boze.
I think I can start. So my name is Boze Hancock, and I'm working with the Nature Conservancy with their global marine team, and have been involved in marine habitat restoration on a global scale, starting programs in a lot of different geographies for nearly 2 decades now. So what I'll do is just try and give what's necessarily a very brief overview of oyster restoration on a global scale. And if I start with oyster restoration, it seems a little odd probably to have photos that are nothing to do with oysters, but just want to point out that we are looking really at the habitats that make up a functioning ecosystem. And there are really some critical coastal ecosystem components that include these salt marsh seagrass, mangroves, giant kelps, and the reef systems. And the other thing that I'd like to point out is that really the shellfish reefs and the coral reefs are ecologically equivalent. They do the same things, and we tend not to think of the shellfish reefs in the same way as coral reefs, largely because we have done such a good job of removing those shellfish reefs. There aren't many left, but the shellfish really should take over the function of the coral reefs, or the reef forming function at higher latitudes and in estuaries where the corals are not adapted. But as mentioned, we've done a pretty good job of getting rid of bivalve reefs, particularly oyster reefs around the world. This map is a summary of a global study that's over a decade old now. But in essence, what we're looking at there is a comparison of different bays or estuaries over about a 100-year period. So a current assessment of oyster reef area compared to about a century ago. And the dark red areas on that map are areas that have less than 1% of the historic abundance of oyster reef remaining. The lighter red areas are less than 10% of historic. So we actually have, in summary across the globe, less than 15% of oyster reef remaining compared to what was there about 100 years ago. So it really has been a very dramatic decline, really correlating with steam engines or power going into dredge boats. And that global assessment can be brought down onto a number of different scales. One of our speakers tonight, Philine's Ermgassen, produced this assessment, which was actually looking at biomass of oysters around the US. She was also responsible for looking at some of the earlier work in the UK. South Australia, there's been some good work done. Less than 1% of the southern Australian oysters remain. On a national scale in Australia, we've got less than 1% of the southern species and about 8% remaining of the Sydney rock oyster. Hong Kong, less than 5%. China, we're currently estimating, and there's work going on in the UK and Europe on a similar scale. But in summary, we have very little of these habitats remaining. So the question on that large scale is, what happened? What have we done? And there are a number of different causes for that decline that people point to, but that top right photo there is a mountain of shell outside a shucking house. That is only one, and photos like this can be found all over the world. These are the kinds of piles of shells that were the result of that mechanical dredging of massive quantities of shells of oysters once steam engines or power went into dredge boats. And that's been the primary cause of decline. There are others. We've messed with, freshwater flows. We've certainly moderated the environment. We've changed shorelines. There are competing uses. There are a large number of introduced predators and diseases, and they have all had an impact once populations have been driven down to a low level. But it's that fishing that has really been the primary cause of driving populations down to a low level in the first place. So if there used to be a lot and there aren't many left now, who cares? Why should we worry about that? And really the answer to that question is because these habitats, the oyster reefs, actually provide valuable services to us, to communities that rely on them. There's a large cultural component that's associated with some of these habitats. There's obviously production that comes from them, and aquaculture is where that production is focused at the moment. These can, depending on the part of the world and the species involved, be engineered as shoreline protection opportunities, creating a coastal resilience that is required for mitigating some of that coastal erosion and flooding. There's also a very important nutrient mitigation potential from these habitats. They do operate very actively at cycling nutrients and addressing some of the eutrophication issues that are a very large component of coastal issues currently. Fish production is an enormous biodiversity gain from these habitats, and the amount of fish produced is actually very substantial. And we'll get back to that a little later in my presentation. And all of this actually does create an economic impact. The restoration itself is a very large job creator, and the blue economy impact of the flow-on economy from oyster reefs is substantial, and I'll touch on some of that return on investment in a second. So what does actual restoration look like? On a small scale, on a community kind of scale, we are involved in recreating the reef structure, the base of a reef, and then depending on whether or not there are larvae available in the system, adding broodstock to that if we need to increase the larval output. So a community kind of project might involve cleaning shell, bagging that up, transporting that out to a restoration site, and creating a reef base with community involvement and relying on natural settlement, natural recruitment of oyster larvae from the system to populate that reef base. That's a small scale community kind of effort for restoration. We really need to be restoring on a scale that is much bigger than that. So there are a number of areas where we've managed to actually get to some fairly industrial scale restoration to address the loss of that habitat at a scale that's commensurate with the need. And if there is a lack of larvae, if the broodstock in the system is not sufficient to be producing the larvae to provide juveniles to that substrate, then we need to actually build breeding populations as well. And that's an aquaculture assisted operation where larvae tend to be bred in an aquaculture system, set onto something that makes those larvae a manageable unit. They like to go onto shell. Bags of shell are a convenient way of actually manipulating, managing and distributing those larvae that are set and putting them out into the environment to actually build the breeding population to go onto that reef substrate. And there are different ways of looking at substrate. We've used a lot of shell in the past, as you've seen, in bags. Rock has been incredibly successful. Limestone is as successful at attracting, recruiting larvae as shell. And there are a number of different kinds of concrete structures, many of which have been involved in engineering reefs that can act as shoreline protection, as well as providing those other services that were described. This work started in the US, started in North America, really because the legislative environment there created a mechanism for funding restoration. Essentially, Americans love to sue each other. And there is environmental legislation where anybody that damages environment can actually be sued and charged for the cost of replacing that habitat. So that's a mechanism that actually led to this work beginning in North America, but it has spread in the last decade fairly rapidly and with an enormous amount of enthusiasm. There's a lot of work going on in the Asia Pacific region, from China and Hong Kong. Australia has a very large program. New Zealand is focusing on actually quite a lot of mussel restoration as well as oyster reef restoration, and obviously a number of projects in the US. So finally, I'd just like to, I haven't really had time to go into the kind of detail of any of those ecosystem services, but I think it's probably instructive to have a look at one of the larger scale projects in the US and just break down what's been done in Chesapeake Bay. So this is the bay that is adjacent to Washington, DC on the east coast of the US. And there have been some large scale projects implemented in Chesapeake Bay. These came from an executive order during the Obama administration in 2011, and there was actually substantial funding put into that by a governor's agreement in 2014. Harris Creek was the first of the projects there that was completed, and it was actually completed in 2015. And they set up a monitoring that was every 3 years. So in 2018, there was the first comprehensive monitoring of the results of that restoration. Large-scale restoration, multi-partner endeavours, and we can run through just the high level kind of metrics that were associated with the project. 142 hectares of reef were installed there. Over 200,000 cubic meters of substrate went into building the reef base. Onto that reef was over 2.5 billion with a B spat on shell seeded on top of the reef base, for a total cost of that project of 53 million US. So a substantial outlay. But the reason for going through that is to actually just have a quick look at the return on investment from that. So the economic analysis, a regional economic analysis, was conducted following that 2018 monitoring, and the results really are quite eye-catching. The percentage increase of the important commercial fisheries that came from that system are huge. The annual production of blue crabs increased by $11 million a year. There's nearly $23 million a year in increased fisheries production from that system. Labour income, 7.8 million a year, nearly over 300 annual jobs, and the nutrient removal from the system, from those reefs that were installed, depending on the value assigned to a kilo of nitrogen, was somewhere between 3 and 18 million. And these are all annual income numbers, income economic impact. So that, I think, demonstrates that $53 million is actually not an expensive project. It is actually a very attractive investment. So that's those ecosystem services that we've described as being the reason that we should be concerned about restoring some of these habitats. So with that, I'll turn over to the other speakers to dive into some more detail on the topics.
That was great. Thank you both. Thank you so much for this giant perspective of all the oysters. I don't see any question from the chat box, so if you don't mind, I'm gonna ask something. What do you think makes the oysters so unique? So do you think it's the combination of all these services that they provide, or do you think one of their services is not provided by other groups or species, so that's what makes them unique?
So the service that is of most value depends really on where you are. If the environment that you're working in is suffering from high nutrient loads, eutrophication, then it's that nutrient mitigation value that's important. In a cleaner environment, it might be the fish production. Biodiversity is actually a standard benefit that we get regardless of where you are, and that tends to be important. I tend to look at these as structuring habitats, but they are not just structure, they are also collecting up, because oysters filter, they filter large volumes of water. They're taking all of that particulate out of the water that is not available to anything that lives in the reef. And by filtering out those particulates, the organics and the inorganic, they get fed into that reef system and really charge the biomass and the biodiversity of creatures that live in that reef. And that's also the material that drives the denitrification process, the conversion of organically available nitrogen compounds into dinitrogen gas. That's what we're breathing now. 78% of what we're breathing now, it's inert and out of the system. So they create the structure, but they also really supercharge that structure by taking all of the material out of the water column and feeding it into that reef to get the animals in the reef going.
Great, thank you both. We have now a couple very quick questions. I don't know if you can answer super briefly. One is there a difference between the functions of Pacific oysters and European flat oysters, or like, is there a difference, you know, restoring one or other type of oysters?
Yeah, really good question, actually. The Ostrea are generally a full salinity species, so they tend to occur in a much broader range of depths and environments. And the flat oyster in Europe was fished in, you know, the English Channel down to 70 or 80 meters. So there's an enormous area that is available and has historically been oyster reef. The Pacifics tend to be more intertidal, and the larvae benefit from that varying salinity that you get in estuarine environments. So the Crassostrea and Saccostrea tend to be more intertidal and more estuarine located. And that's, you know, when you're looking at site suitability for restoration, you need to be making sure that you're restoring in areas that are suitable for oysters. And the Ostrea give you a much broader range of habitat to actually be suitable for restoration.
Okay, and then there's another question that I think will be totally answered by the end of this workshop, but it's, do you think nitrogen removal is like an excuse to finance restoration projects? And so I'm gonna say yes, but what do you say?
Well, it's actually a very valid incentive for restoration projects, because so many of our coastal waters are suffering from eutrophication. You need to be careful, because in extreme cases, you know, the result of eutrophication is anoxia, and even oysters need some oxygen. You can't restore an oyster reef where, you know, oxygen collapses completely. But they are also pretty tough. They will actually thrive in fairly eutrophied waters as long as there's oxygen.
Okay.
So they can be used as a tool in all but extreme cases.
Makes sense. Okay, so now the audience is like writing more questions, but I really want to have the, you know, give the chance to the other speakers to move along. So we're gonna go to Hein, please. Will you introduce yourself and let us know about you?
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody, or good evening to some, or morning. My name is Hein Sas. I am a freelance consultant in trying to improve the marine and the estuarine environment, mostly European countries, mostly Netherlands. We also work internationally. I am the current secretary of NORA, the Native Oyster Restoration Alliance, together with Katrin. We work together. Of course, that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm also the secretary of the Dutch Shellfish Reef Restoration Alliance. So I am till over my ears into shellfish. And by the way, I like to eat them very much too. But restoration, of course, now is urgently needed for various reasons. And that is my mission, my personal mission in life. That's why I work with these organizations. And I would like to tell you something more about it. Shall I share my screen?
Sure, all yours.
Just a moment. Yes, it's visible, I suppose. So I'm
Yes,
not going
perfect.
to talk. I'm not going to talk too much about the contents of projects and like the science which Boze told you about, and that's of course why Boze is here. And we're talking about the organizational challenges, the political challenges, the public awareness, and how we can stimulate that, and what kind of role that NORA is. Right? NORA is the Native Oyster Restoration Alliance for Europe, so I will use that abbreviation all the time. Some people think NORA is my girlfriend. That's not the case. I talk about her so much. So I'm going to talk about what we do and what we want to do, and the difference we can make, and how we can help each other in that in various European countries. So By the way, I'll just click away the pictures because it's blocking the screen, I think, partially. Our mission: to facilitate large-scale restoration of native oyster reefs in European marine waters. All the European marine waters, they were originally there, and they're not there anymore. The Olsen map, the map you see here on the right side, where is my cursor? Ah, here it is, shows the original reefs. They're not there anymore. A very nice picture of, we constructed for the Dutch Alliance, partially an artist's impression, partially a photo of a mixed oyster, so Casostrea, Pacific oyster, and native oyster reef in Dutch waters. You see the richness which it has. That's why we want to restore it. It's not that we like the species so much. As I said, I like to eat them very much indeed. It's not the species that is rare. The species is still there, but it's the reefs that are lacking, and it's the reefs that provide the habitat and the ecosystem functions. So the objectives of NORA are to protect bottom, marine, seafloor against disturbance, like beam trawling, to get more protected areas, and in those protected areas, active restoration. And you need to be active in it because, of course, they are a foundational habitat. The habitat is largely gone, and native oysters are slow to reproduce and spread, certainly offshore. And that's, I should underline that it's the offshore, and also Boze said that native oysters can exist to water depths of about 80 meters. In that sense, it is, together with some other shellfish species like Modiolus, the horse mussel, a very special thing, which indeed for marine enrichment is a keystone species. And other species, other shellfish species like the Pacific oysters just aren't capable of that. And we need to be active because, unfortunately, unlike the Pacific oyster, the native oyster is not easy in spreading. What did we do as NORA since our foundation in 2017? Foundation with a huge help of the German government, by the way. We produced a lot of material on the how. How do you do it? Because nobody knew. The ecology was largely gone, knowledge is gone, and how do you actively restore a reef? So we produced a series of basic handbooks and guidelines to work on the how. This is all available via our website. But of course, you have to take different steps to get there. And what we see is also in the various European countries is two phases, basically two phases. Well, there may be a third phase when we're all ready with restoring oyster reefs, but we're not there yet. Phase one is when people in countries, in areas, in regions start to ask the question, why and how to restore those reefs? And the challenge is then indeed to get the awareness, to get the need and the necessity of oyster reef, native oyster reef restoration on the public and policy agenda. To close those knowledge gaps, how do you do it? As I said, NORA worked very actively in that field. And of course, set up and protect adequately monitored pilots. Also, NORA helped a lot in getting those things done. When you have gone through phase one, you can start to phase two, scaling up. What we want to achieve is not so much that you have to resupply new oysters all the time. Where you want to go is that you create self-sustaining ecosystem reef scale. That's where you want to go. And then you have many more very big challenges. Of course, if getting the oyster reef restoration, sorry for the typo, even higher on the public and policy agenda. Create large and actually protected areas, particularly against bottom disturbance. Enhance the production of the small ones, which you need to deploy your reef. And of course, increase budgets. And there are many more things you need to do. I don't want to be exhaustive on that list, but I just wanted to show something to you, namely that in Europe, there is a lot of dynamics currently. The blue circles on the map is the representation on our last conference, which was in November of last year. We had almost 250 registrations. By the way, we have about 400 people in our active network, which is fantastically maintained by Katrin. And what we see is where the big blue dots are countries like Ireland, UK, Netherlands, also Germany, Belgium is emerging. They are moving, these countries are moving to phase 2. They have gone through phase 1. There are many pilots with lots of experience, lots of science. Also, well, still can always be more, quite a lot of government attention. So these are the countries who are at the verge of scaling up. The phase 1 countries are Scandinavia and more Southern Europe. But it's very fascinating to see that particularly Southern Europe is what I would call waking up. I think the fact that Yves and Marina and colleagues have organized this Ocean Decade Lab is an example of that, of the people working in Spain. We see now also people in Italy, Croatia. France is really moving now, and of course that's a very important oyster country, also for the native oyster still. We see a lot more attention growing there. So this, the movement is, the growth of awareness is very promising. Now, that means that for NORA, we have 2 types of challenges. We still have to close many knowledge gaps, and we're working on it. The site selection criteria, improve the survival of the youngsters, increase the reliability of production of disease-free and maybe also hopefully also disease-resistant and genetically diverse oysters, the young ones, as I said, quantify better what the goods and services are of those reefs and the biodiversity. That is where lots of science still comes in, but we also, for the scaling up challenges, need to do other things like the scaling up of the production capacity, designate those really protected, marine protected areas, generate much more financial support. And I think certainly for the countries more in Southern Europe and France, link the oyster aquaculture production and the restoration projects together. And I think that's a very promising road to go. Words like restoration, aquaculture for shellfish in general are zooming on the internet at this moment, and these days, and to see how we can somehow close the current gap between the production people and the restoration people is a very important challenge and a promising one. Lots of challenges, but we also have opportunities. Of course, we have the United Nations Decade. Much of the biodiversity restoration efforts are aimed at terrestrial projects still, but the marine focus is really emerging in individual countries, as I showed, those phase 1 and phase 2 countries, countries really waking up at that, but also at the EU level. Of course, there is the biodiversity strategy, but also something is coming in. It's going to European Parliament by the end of this month, an ecosystem restoration law. It may not be called a law, but it may become a directive or something like that, but a very strict regulation, still to be discussed in Parliament, but with a very promising draft, constraining countries to actively restore degraded ecosystems. And that, of course, we still hope, and we are trying to influence that this restoration law or directive is going to have very specific and clear and ambitious targets. And in the draft, they are still. What will happen in European Parliament, I don't know, but we try to influence it as NORA and other organizations. And of course, to the back of it, we have the OSPAR agreements, which are difficult to apply, but oyster reefs are a prominent target in OSPAR. And of course, that is an important background to all regulation. So what I do think is when we really work together, that we can make a difference, that we can tip the scales. It is a very critical time period to enhance European native oyster reef restoration, and a cooperation across Europe to stimulate this and to stimulate the awareness at public and policy level may, I think, even tip the scales. And that's what we will be aiming for at NORA, but we will need all the help, all the ideas, all the support we can get. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you, Hein. Very, very clear NORA's functions, which are not easy to accomplish.
But it's fun to work on it.
I know, a lot of work, but very stimulating. Very true. Okay, because our next speaker has a little bit of a time problem. There's a Q&A little icon. If the audience wants to write questions there, each one of us can answer, like writing them down. So if there's, at any point, anybody wants to ask a question that I can't ask to the speakers later on, you can always write it there and we'll do our best to answer. And so I'm just moving on to Ruth, please.
Thank you, Eve. And yes, apologies everyone, because I'm going to have to leave shortly after this, but I will put up my email address and you're very welcome to send me questions and I will do my best to answer those if there's anything that comes up after this talk. So I will just share my screen and hopefully you can all see that. So thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I am a lecturer at the University of Exeter in the UK, and I use a range of sources from ecology and also historical disciplines, so very mixed, to try to understand what our marine ecosystems looked like in the past, how they functioned, how they have changed, what influence or drove those changes, and what impacts this has for our marine ecosystems and of course ourselves today. So that's about me, and I'm going to tell you a bit about the work that is being conducted by the Historical Ecology Working Group within NORA, which I chair, but there are many people, and I will present some of the names of the co-authors at the end here. So this is the result of a lot of people's work that I'm presenting today. So before I start talking about oysters, I wanted to take a step back and talk to you about why I believe historical perspectives are needed today, particularly given that we're in a period of great change. Our climate is changing rapidly. There are many other changes happening within our oceans and within our societies. But what I would argue is that looking to the past can help us answer many questions that are relevant today. For example, what did our seabeds used to look like? How abundant were the species that lived within our marine environments, and what benefits did we gain from this? And also, when did ecosystems change and by how much? And the reason that, and of course, what caused these changes? And I believe that this are of direct relevance for conservation and management today. For example, they help inform questions about where and what can we restore, what can we restore to, which species need to be conserved, what should we prioritize, what should our management goals be, what is an ecosystem that has recovered, what does that look like? And apologies, there's a bit of a delay here. So, oh, and of course, what wider benefits may occur. So part of the problem that we have when it comes to looking at changes in marine ecosystems through time is that our impacts on marine ecosystems, our influences on these systems started in some cases many centuries ago. However, our ability to sort of observe beneath the surface of the water and to sort of monitor and document that only really started in recent decades. And of course, even today, it's hugely expensive. It's logistically difficult to survey beneath the seas. And as this picture very nicely shows, particularly in sort of northern European seas, marine ecosystem changes are often very much hidden from view. And what this leads us to, it means is that we tend to underestimate just how much our oceans have changed. So my area of research is historical ecology. And essentially, it tries to uncover changes that have occurred in marine ecosystems in the period before scientific monitoring. So this can cover decadal to hundreds to thousands of years. And to do this, we'll use historical sources that span a whole range of sources, really. We can look at paintings, what people were eating, what they were drawing. We can look at scientific or fisheries logbooks. We can look at, in the era of photographs, or we can use descriptions that come from popular media that used to write about people going fishing and what they found, what they caught. We can also gain an understanding from menus, from cookery books of what people were eating and how much these species were worth. Were they really abundant? Were they cheap? Were they a speciality dish? Were they only seen occasionally? That sort of thing. And so this is exactly what we are doing for the native oyster across Europe. The particular questions that we are asking are, what did native oyster habitats look like in the past? Where did these habitats occur and how extensive were they? How important were the oysters to local communities? What were they catching? Where were these oysters going? And when did we start to lose these native oyster habitats? We know that they have declined, but when and why and by how much? So we hope that this information will feed into restoration goals. And the particular sources that we are using for this, very similar to what I just showed you, but a few more specific details. We have, for example, sort of government sources here. They might have been petitions, they might have been commissions of evidence that people collected, they might have been sort of landings data that government officials were collecting. We also have, because the oyster has always been a little bit special, even when it was really highly abundant, there's articles in newspapers, there's lots of popular articles. We also have sort of old scientific documentation, such as this one from the 1750s, where they described what animal life they found upon oysters. We can use museum collections, we can use archaeological collections, and we can use old nautical charts such as this one, which shows us where oyster grounds were in the 1850s. So what did oyster habitats look like? Well, it's pretty hard, as you might imagine, to find first-hand descriptions, but those that we are finding are sort of giving us an indication of what these habitats used to look like. And I think these echo what restoration projects are also finding. So for example, one of the more frequent terms that is used are talking about these oysters, not as individuals, species, but as clumps, many individuals together, and these heavy laden beds. So you get this impression that, you know, that these actually were quite significant structures in their own way. So people would try to avoid these large oyster habitats in certain parts of the sea because they would tear people's nets. So unless they were actually going directly fishing for oysters, they didn't want to go anywhere near them because these clumps would tear the nets, and they'd be in patches within bays as well. So maybe 8 or 10 all stuck together. There's also intriguing glimpses of some oyster habitats because, of course, all of these habitats that they're talking about before have been fished to some extent, so they're already not pristine habitats. But here's an example of one in Ireland where they talked about an area that hasn't been fished for a long time, and they talk about it becoming hard like a rock. So essentially that the oysters are getting, and maybe some other species as well, getting knitted really closely together. And indeed, people were saying that in order to access those oysters, you would need to get a really heavy piece of equipment like a dredge, worked from a very large fishing vessel to actually break up these beds. So that gives you some intriguing glimpses of what these habitats used to be like, and it's certainly not the odd individual here and there. Oyster habitats could extend over very large areas as well. So this picture is a map from the 1830s from the north coast of Denmark, showing where they suspect oyster habitats to be and where they suspect them to extend. Now, descriptions of large habitats are also common. So this one talking about oysters, a noble bank or bed, and this is actually an area in the Irish Sea next to the Isle of Man, and they believe that it extended above 2 miles in length, so over 2 miles, and near 2 in, they say depth, they mean width, and distant about, starting about 1.5 miles from the shore. So this, there are obviously descriptions of many smaller beds as well, but here is one of a frankly enormous area of habitat of oysters, which was reported in the late 19th century in the North Sea. And they described this as being nearly 80 miles long and 25 miles wide. And again, this was an area where people wanted to actively avoid. So tellingly, this was in the area time before steam power got going. About 10 years later, the trawlers were not quite so worried about getting stuck on this area of habitat. But they were saying that the oysters are so numerous that they fill up the trawl net and they actually slow down the vessel to the point where it can't go anywhere. So these might not have been sort of continuous habitats that extended, but they did sort of certainly occurred in clumps over very large areas. If I can move this on, apologies, it's being a bit slow. And also there were lots of other species as well associated with these oyster habitats. So they really form these communities. And again, this is something that restoration efforts are really starting to show. But we have a few glimpses from the past as well. People talking about the tree-like corallines from the 1750s, from the 19th century, talking about sponges, tubes of small worms, what they called sea hands. It is a bit of fun trying to work out what they actually mean, because of course they didn't have sort of the scientific terminology all the time, so working out which creatures these actually are. And ferns and softworm dunes, sea squirts and other small shellfish that needed to be cleaned off, which made the oysters quite smelly if they went to market, so they were often deemed a little bit of a pest. We're also discovering just like when oyster fisheries declined and by how quickly across different regions. So this bit is focused on the UK, but of course is data from elsewhere that we are collecting. So some of these are just, these are descriptive. So this would say it took 20 boats 7 years to dredge away the oysters. This is from an area in the Isle of Man where that A is in the Irish Sea. The oysters were thick. One boat got 30,000 oysters in a week. But we have also got some quantitative descriptions. So from Newhaven here in Scotland, what you can see is that they recorded annual landings of 30 million oysters in the early part of the 19th century. This declined really quite quickly. By the 1860s, there are fishermen getting very, very worried about these oyster beds. Really believing that they are going downhill, and they were correct, they really were, but they continued, and this red line is when we start to get sort of annual government collected statistics, which, as you can show, they start when this fishery is really long gone. The same also occurs in other areas. So this is Jersey and in the channel there, and you've also got an area in Wales called the Mumbles fishery in Swansea. And again, you can see that by the time these records come in, this fishery, it is a very low ebb, and really was collecting around about 9 million oysters at its peak in the mid-19th century. So you can see that there's vast amounts of information that we can gather, and some of it, you know, it's a bit, you know, there's glimpses here and there, but altogether it's really sort of beginning to show you that these massive changes occurred in the mid-19th century onwards, or even before them. So this is very much a work in progress, folks. So there may be some mistakes. There's certainly not everything in here that should be in here at the moment, but this is what we are gathering as a group at the moment in terms of looking at the locations that are recorded. So these are mostly records of historical fisheries. They span from say a couple of thousand years ago. The majority of them are from the 18th and 19th centuries, and we have some that are up until the present day as well. So a little bit of sorting out to do, but I thought this is quite exciting to show, because this really shows you just how abundant oysters were. So these are all locations where, you know, they were abundant enough in many places to be fished, often in great quantities. And they really were sort of all over sort of many of these coastal locations, and particularly you can see in the North Sea and the Channel here, but also just all around many countries. So these, this is what we've identified so far, and basically it shows you that really native oysters were found in so many places in European seas, and only a handful of these exist as fisheries or as indeed habitats today. So to conclude, thank you for sticking with me here. So just to bring you back to, you know, why we're doing this and what we're finding, and that we're hoping that this will inform sort of planning and policy initiatives, including restoration initiatives. We know that oysters were once highly abundant across European seas. We know that these habitats could be several miles in extent, maybe broken up in into smaller chunks, but really quite extensive. And they were made up of large numbers of oysters clumped together, plus many other species. And we also know just how much coastal communities depended upon these oysters for food and for jobs. So bringing these oysters back, we hope will, and in fact we are certain will, create more diverse and healthier seas. And I just want to say thank you to all of the many co-authors as part of this working group, and any mistakes are mine, and please direct questions to me here if I can't answer them today. Thanks.
Very good, Ruth, thank you. Since I know you have to go and we don't have questions from the audience, we'll just move on to Philine. And so people can always send you an email, right? Okay, thank you, Ruth.
Thanks.
Okay, Philine.
Thanks very much. Expecting question. I need to find my slide. Excuse me.
They're there, hiding somewhere.
Okay. Thank you everyone for your patience, and thank you for inviting me today to introduce to you a whole host of restoration projects. This is just an attempt to provide a brief overview of what has already been done here in Europe. So Boze gave us fantastic insight into what can be done globally, or has been done globally, and kind of the scales of restoration elsewhere. And Europe has been a little bit later to start the process, but we're very quick learners. And what I'm hoping to do today is to take you through the map of Europe as far as projects goes, and introduce you to as many of these projects as I can. I've actually done a little bit of a sampling here. So essentially what I've tried to do is work with the NORA network to provide you with examples of different kinds of restoration and the kind of scale of restoration that we're seeing now in Europe. And I'm going to take you from inshore marinas through to the offshore, and just show you the kind of complete scope and scale and aims of a lot of our restoration efforts. So the first thing to draw attention to is this figure, again from a NORA and Native Oyster Network publication, which illustrates how many restoration projects we now have ongoing. And I know that since this map was drawn, there are new points on this map already, particularly off the Netherlands. I'm seeing Hein nodding very enthusiastically. But this point does illustrate that essentially, you know, it's a short time ago that we started this process, and there were a few early adopters, but very quickly it's kind of snowballed, and we really are seeing an enormous growth in restoration projects across Europe. So I'm just going to provide a flavor, starting with one of our oldest projects, which is in Essex, where that square is. And Essex is one of the few locations in England, in Great Britain, that has a remaining native oyster fishery, and where you can find these oyster clumps that Ruth was referring to so eloquently in her talk. So these are ones that were fished up with the oystermen when I had the pleasure of visiting them off that coast. And the NORA Essex Native Oyster Restoration Initiative is unique in some ways in that it's a really fantastic partnership with the oystermen in that area. They have a a centuries-long experience that they're very happy to share with the native oyster restoration efforts that are ongoing there. They don't use smacks. This is actually some oyster smacks that are restored in the area, and that only once a year they come out to oyster. The rest of the time they're used for sailing. But there is a really strong heritage and culture associated with oysters in this particular area of Mersey Island. Like all restoration projects, it's a really rich partnership of many different organizations. So I won't be able to illustrate this for every single project, but every single project is a partnership. It's a partnership between statutory bodies who have to help navigate the complexity of restoration. It's a partnership between conservation organizations, academics, fishermen, offshore wind, as we come to later. And so I just wanted to illustrate the kind of numbers of people, the number of stakeholders involved in any project that is undertaken. The other thing, that being one of the earlier projects to be picked up in England, it's been a really exciting process of navigating the nature conservation legislation and working out how we can restore an essentially extinct habitat. So this is one area where the earlier round of marine conservation zones, this was the one site that was singled out as being of special conservation interest for native oyster restoration. And even in this case, there were real issues with regards to how native oysters could be restored alongside other existing and really valuable habitats. So a lot of work went into actually finding out where we could do the restoration without impacting on other features. And we came up with a spatial plan, essentially, where oysters can be restored on the subtidal sediments, mixed sediments, and then there's still plenty of other habitat around. So these complexities are all being smoothed out along the way, which is partly why we're seeing this increasing acceleration of projects. So the aims in this project, like in many projects, was to increase the number of oysters, but the oystermen would like to see them not just increased, obviously, in our restoration beds, but also on their fisheries grounds, which have been closed since, I want to say 2013, something along those lines, since their population crashed. And once we see a healthy stock recovery on those fish beds, they'll then be allowed to be opened, but the restored sites will remain closed to act as a broodstock and for their habitat and biodiversity and other associated values. And they're doing this restoration, like in many projects, by improving the underlying substrate, the shell that's previously been either sedimented in by rivers, bringing a lot of sediment from the agricultural lands nearby, or from being fished out across the centuries. So that was a quick dip in there. I'm going to take you a little bit further south now to just show you how they're scaling up. So in NORA, they are also scaling up, but I wanted to provide multiple examples. So we're going to go to the Solent project, which is on the south coast of England. And the Solent is one of the busiest waterways in the UK. It's got a huge number of boats, but it's also got shipping lanes, a huge number of people, 1.5 million people associated with that waterway area. And they are also undertaking, again, through partnership with Blue Marine Foundation, University of Portsmouth, and a host of other partners, which I think I show some here, a restoration project that's attempting to restore intact habitats throughout the Solent waterway. And it's doing this through a number of different ventures, broodstock nurseries, and also a reef restoration site. So to show you what is involved in reef restoration in Europe, it is also scaling up, learning lessons from the US and from Australia. It involves taking large amounts of culch, so shell or gravel materials in this case, shipping them out into your desired and pre-agreed and permitted location. There's a lot of licensing involved with all these works with Maritime Organization. That sediment, that material is just very gently placed on the bottom to try and reduce sediment plumes. And then once you have your sediment structure, they're then seeding them with adult oysters. So they have to go to the hatcheries where they, to the grow out locations where they have oysters, collect them, and then bring them back to the lab. And this looks like a lot of fun, but all of those oysters are subject to a biosecurity clean to avoid the import of any species that they don't wish to have. It looks like an awful lot of fun. It's really not that much fun, but there are a host of really enthusiastic partners that are willing to help with such important and incredibly labor-intensive work, which is very, very good. Those adult oysters are then redistributed onto your underlying culch. And then as you can see, you start to see these individuals lying on your culch bed, and in the long term, you monitor to see whether or not you're getting growth. And in the Solent, it's kind of a unique example as well, because they're not just thinking about oysters, they're increasingly thinking about seascape level restoration, about how you can couple oyster restoration with seagrass restoration or salt marsh restoration in particular, but also thinking about its impacts on potentially acting as nursery grounds and linkages to kelp, for example. So there's a really big vision here that in this large waterway is beginning to build, and these partnerships are being formed. And it's a very exciting place to keep an eye on for the future. The final inshore project that I wanted to draw your attention to, it takes a very different approach. This is the Wild Oysters project, which is spread across 3 locations in Wales, North England, and in Scotland. And just very briefly, their approach is to work within marinas and to use marinas as broodstock, essentially locations. So adult oysters are put into cages, they're then stored under the marinas walkways, and this provides then a broodstock which they're hoping will settle to other areas. It also allows the oysters they're bringing in to grow up so that they might be used for restoration when they're a bit bigger. And importantly, they're really fantastic for public engagement. There's a huge amount of public engagement built into this project, teaching the local children about oysters that have previously been extinct in these areas, essentially telling them about what they might be getting back. And getting them really enthused about oysters, but also the host of marine life that associates with oysters in these cages. So it's a really fantastic marine biology lesson, as well as being about oysters. So taking us to the offshore, I'm going to start with the German projects, which have also had a long history of development. So this is just to illustrate that it's not a question of deciding to do restoration one day and doing it the next. It takes an awful lot of planning, an awful lot of work. And I think this is really well illustrated by the timeline that the project lent me to share with you, where feasibility work has led through to a pilot project and ultimately a really big scale pilot project in the offshore. So again, we're talking about a completely different method of doing restoration from on the inshore. It involves big boats and an awfully intensive scientific and technological approach. And the pilot project here was again putting out culch and also putting out young oysters. I think it was 100,000 young oysters. Corina can shake her head. Yeah, nod, excellent. And then monitoring how they grow out, monitoring how the larvae are distributed from those individuals, monitoring what biodiversity is associated with their pilot sites, and also using some reef blocks as well. So it's a really exciting project, which also has yielded exciting results. So these are some images of the spat settlement that they've had on the materials that they laid out at their restoration site in 2020. So there has been some recruitment to the site, which is obviously what every restoration partner would love to see in their locations. So very positive news. It's not just that we're learning, but we're also seeing results. And I think that's, as we think about doing restoration elsewhere, expanding across Europe, that's a really important lesson to take away. Not everything works everywhere all the time, but we are learning and we are seeing successes. The other thing that is happening within the Restore the project, Proceed project, which is part of the same institute, is hatchery. And again, this is not the only project that is doing hatchery work. There are numerous other projects that I've already spoken about that also are engaging with hatcheries and producing young oysters. But as both Hein and Boze alluded to, we do need more oysters. They are not naturally occurring in the abundance they were as described by Ruth. And we're not seeing the recruitment that we need in order to restore the populations. So learning how to get enough oysters and to get enough oysters to the locations where we need them in the status that we need them in with regards to disease, for example, is really important. And again, a lot of lessons are being learned here. And it's not a small undertaking. These are the algal tanks that are required to feed the young oysters when you're trying to keep a biosecure facility. These measures are very important and they're very challenging to balance exactly right. So these lessons are very important to be learned and shared. So the other places where a lot of work is happening in the offshore is in the Netherlands. And again, this is just a brief flavor to illustrate that it's not, in the case of the German project, this is an MPA, it's a Natura 2000 site, it's a biodiversity project. In the case of the Netherlands, there's a large amount of work, not all work, but a large amount of work ongoing in nature enhancement in wind farm sites. And the little image on the side is just to give you a sense of the pace of projects that are being taken up now in the Netherlands. It's a really phenomenal rate of growth as this idea is adopted into wind farm sites in the Netherlands. But also there is also work going for nature conservation on inshore as well. So it's not just this, but I wanted to illustrate again these offshore locations, these novel ways and approaches. And again, these projects are happening between or around the windmills, I want to call them, associated with the scour materials. And again, it's a very intensive and technologically challenging process. And these cages have been put out to check for growth and survival, for example, around the potential pilot locations before full deployment is undertaken. And again, culture is also relayed off boats. So similar techniques in a different setting, and very exciting to see the growth that's happening in the Netherlands. So I'm going to take you to a final two-step point up to Scotland, to the DEEP project. And the DEEP project is in the Dornoch Firth, which is also home to the Glenmorangie distillery. That's the main point I want you to take away from the slide. There's a distillery there, and there used to be an awful lot of oysters, but they are not there anymore. And what this project is exciting because it's a partnership between nature conservation, academia, and industry. The Glenmorangie distillery is really enthusiastic about restoring native oysters to the Firth because as part of their remediation of their own impacts in the system. So they already have an anaerobic digestion plant that removes 95% of their organic discharge. And they're really interested in ensuring that the other 5% is dealt with, and that they also see the positive biodiversity and other ecosystem services benefits associated with the oysters there. This means that there's also a whole host of other ecosystem service assessments that are ongoing in this in this partnership to assess how much carbon is being removed as a result of native oysters being present in forming reefs. Which brings me to the final project that I'm just going to briefly introduce as a flavor, but further down south in our map, it had to come up in this little box. It's really indicative of the new growth we're seeing within the NORA community is the Menor project in Spain. And this is another project that is interested in bioremediation services from native oysters. And this is a very recent photo of some broodstock collection, as you can see, in a very beautiful location. And I'm going to leave it at that because I know that Marina can say a lot more about it, but it's a really exciting example of where native oyster restoration is headed within Europe. So thank you to all the projects and partners who have allowed me to share their projects with you today. And I hope that wasn't too fast or whirlwind tour. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Like, how can you fit so many different projects in 15 minutes? That was awesome.
I talk too fast is probably the answer.
No, because I mean, I could understand. So that's very good job.
Thank you.
Okay, there's in the question box, it says maybe a question for Philine. An enthusiastic group of Danish water Vikings are eagerly exploring the possibility to start a new project in Denmark. So can we draw some expertise from NORA? And where do we start?
I'm very excited to hear that. I'm actually Danish. I know I sound English. I was born in London. So please talk to me.
Okay, we'll provide at the end of the workshop, we're going to provide all the names and emails for everybody. So the audience can just get in touch with us.
But joking aside, there are the handbooks, which I'm glad you draw attention to, but the actual handbook on how to do restoration has really most things that you need to know about undertaking a restoration project in Europe. It is got a UK focus from a policy perspective, but all of the steps and the timelines are not going to differ very much between geographies within that. So that is a great place to start. And then I would just suggest interacting with the NORA network. You know, get involved in some of the working groups, meet people who have undertaken similar things and learn from their experiences is by far the best way to get the answers that you want, because there's nothing second to first-hand experience, and and the NORA community, you know, it's about collaboration. So if people are turning up to these workshops, it's because they want to share their experience as much as they want to learn from others. So please do get involved.
Yeah, great answer. Yeah. Okay, thank you so much, Philine. So we're moving to Corina and Katrin, and they're going to talk about something a little bit different. Thank you.
Okay, so just a few words to my part. I'm a freelancer and I'm involved in the NORA network, so to say, since the foundation of NORA. And today I will speak about, together with Corina from the RV, about outreach and communication tools. But to start with, we heard a lot so far about the scientific aspects of oyster restoration, sharing knowledge on restoration projects. But you know all, we are in the decade of ocean science for sustainable development. And for achieving the SDGs, we need more than science. We need education and information. We need outreach and communication about its unique species, its capability of building biogenic reefs, like we heard it, by this enhancing biodiversity, improving water quality, and providing lots of other ecosystem services. So we are in a situation, we already heard about this, that we had a historical decline in once widespread European oyster populations, with the result that natural occurrence has widely distinguished. Oysters, and so our native or European oysters, are known namely as a high valuable foodstuff in the broad public, whereas native oysters in their natural environment are more or less hidden secrets, preferring subtidal areas, being mostly out of sight, and therefore being largely unknown in the broad public. By now we have, like Philine pointed out, restoration projects in different phases across Europe, from coastal regions to offshore areas, and the number of projects and scale of restoration efforts are increasing. And so is the accompanying educational effort in these projects too. The scientific community already knows, and so show other target groups, that native oyster conservation and restoration play an integral role for achieving a healthy and resilient ocean, stopping the loss of biodiversity and providing food and shelter and habitat for lots of marine species, and thereby contributing intensively to achieve the SDG 14, life below water. And we already heard about that from both, that oyster restoration is also important for future steps to achieve SDG 13 by strengthening resilience to climate-related disasters. It's coastal protection, for example, that oyster reefs deliver. And native oyster restoration contributes to the SDG 12 by fostering nature-based sustainable solutions for production in the aquaculture sector on various levels. Corina, next slide, please. Native oysters, as well as their restoration efforts or projects, are highly suitable for following the SDGs 4 and 17, transforming subtasks of these SDGs in concrete actions and measures, and changing people's relationship with the ocean, what we want to achieve with this ocean decade of science for sustainable development. Restoration projects across Europe and NORA itself increased their outreach activities within the 5 last years significantly in a wide range, from scientific publications. Hein and Philine already talked about it. We developed science transfer materials up to school programs and stakeholder engagement in the different projects. So our aims are raising awareness for the value of native oysters, native oyster reefs, and their ecosystem services. We aim to enhance the understanding of biodiversity decline and its drivers, because oysters are really a good example to show how human impact is responsible for a decline of a species. We aim at initiating behavioral changes in different target groups and fostering a transformative change. We increase the visibility of the restoration efforts And by involving local communities and stakeholder groups, Philine had given some really good examples for this, we aim at fostering the acceptance and the support of native oyster restoration and research projects to scale up restoration and consequently also funding for even more scaling up. Our overall goal is the increase of protecting and restoring marine biodiversity together with engaged people of various target groups. So can you click the next slide, please, Corina? Coming to the outreach and communication tools, I would like to start with the example communication via website and social media. Each project has meanwhile an own website and uses some social media tools like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. And depending on the financial and personal situation or setting of the project, the extent of outreach is differing. As an example, I'll give you a short insight here into the Alliance's website, targeting so far to the scientific and NORA community, but as Hein already pointed out, with a future perspective to the broad public and the political level. So if you're interested also in the project that Philine has shown, you can go to this category projects on our website. There will be links to the project's website and to contact persons too. And under the category resources, you will find a lot of these outreach material, often developed in cooperation with or by the UK Native Oyster Network and by the NORA Outreach Working Group. And under the NORA publications, you will also find the more scientific orientated publications, which have been developed within the last 2 to 3 years, often also together with the UK NON and also with strong involvement of Philine. She was NORA coordinator until December last year. Download numbers reach several hundred, up to 1,200. And you can also find fact sheets there, as well as the social media asset for the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. We have an expert database to get in touch with oyster experts across Europe and beyond about different oyster topics. And the newsletter you can subscribe for is published more or less monthly and reaches about 350 to 400 subscribers. The Twitter account has about 650 followers so far. Okay, so with this short introduction, I will now hand over to Corina, head of the NORA Outreach Working Group, and she will give you an insight into some outreach tools. Thank you. Corina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katrin. So now you know all about the NORA homepage, and I hope you visit it and have a look by yourself. It's a lot of information on there. And I just quickly give an overview over our NORA Outreach Working Group. The group was funded about 2 years ago, and it is our old game to transfer knowledge about the oyster restoration to the public and to stakeholders, as it was already said in some previous talks by my colleagues. You see here again a map of the NORA project partners, but you have seen it in the presentations before. So all or a lot of those projects also deal with outreach and include outreach because it's an essential part of their project. So in the outreach working group, we really try to gather all the projects from different countries and exchange knowledge and lessons learned, give back practice examples from within or also beyond Europe. So for example, we already had some talks from Australian colleagues or from the US, like you heard from Boze. They are some years ahead and also very, very active in the outreach and educational part. And it's always great to learn from each other and from those examples. So that's really the aim of the outreach group. So far, we only had to meet in online meetings regularly. We hope that at some point we might have the chance to get an in-person meeting, but so far it's online, so that's also easy to join from all over Europe and beyond. And yeah, we also share the existing outreach materials. So here again, thanks to the Native Oyster Network UK and Ireland, you will see when you visit the homepage that there are great graphics, for example, which were produced by them. And they are also available on the homepage. And whenever a project produces something, we always think about how could we make it visible and how could we spread it also to everyone interested who can use it. and also develop outreach material by ourselves within the group as far as possible. So just as an example from the projects, what could be the different target groups and the outreach activities which are associated to it. So as Philine already said, for example, from the Wild Oyster Project, students of different age classes are really a great target group for a lot of projects. And there is educational material produced by the projects for different age classes, for different schools. The different school systems of different countries. That's always a big thing that you have to look at if it's really working in your country. There are different school programs where they can get actively involved in the research or have a look into experiments. And where possible, there are also excursions to the restoration sites sometimes for our project. So I'm in the German restoration projects, and as you heard from Philine, they are offshore. So of course we can't bring the students to the offshore area where we work underwater in 30-meter depth. So this is really a privilege to those onshore restoration projects, and it's great to see also from my view, so to say, what is possible when it's on the coast, and to see how students or children get involved and get excited about the oysters, which are very new to them then. Another target group or target groups would be tourists or local residents. And for this, projects provide info boards, like you can see here in the picture. That's actually from our project, and that's the island of Helgoland, which is far offshore in the German North Sea. And since we don't have oysters on the coast, we provide the information on those info boards about the historical distribution of the oysters, why they were so important and why the beds were so huge once historically, and about the importance of oyster reefs for biodiversity, as well as for all kinds of ecosystems in the ocean. There are, of course, flyers or also tours through hatcheries or institutions, which you can offer to tourists or residents or all interested nature lovers. And then there are also events. So hopefully this summer there will be events again. So that was really scarce before, but there you can, for example, set up info booths and talk about restoration, really get in touch with people interested. So we know, for example, from our UK projects within NORA that there sometimes are oyster food festivals. So that would be something for Hein then, as I heard. And in this case, you can kind of use the love for oysters or for eating oysters to get the people interested in also the ecosystem they build and the ecological importance of these animals and organisms. So really getting to talk to people on events, that's really a big part of outreach, and I hope it can be done again soon. And then there's, of course, this target group, which is always called stakeholders and can mean anything, basically. So that's also local residents or communities, but of course also politicians. So everyone who is somehow affected or can benefit from this restoration project you're planning, and can also help you doing it as long as they understand why it is so important. And that's really a big thing in projects, even before the project starts, to get funding, but also when the project is going on, to get people on board, so to say, to work together and to achieve something bigger than if everyone is just doing their little thing. And next to the stakeholders I already talked about, there are, for example, also boat owners. So this is a screenshot also from the Wild Oyster Project, where they work in the harbors with the oyster nurseries, and they really work together or try to inform the boat owners about what they can do to reduce their impact, to help the native oysters to come back. So this is helping the ecosystem, but also a really active communication of the project. Then there are, of course, restaurants for some shell recycling going on in the project, or also divers, which are naturally very interested in what is going on the seafloor. So for those stakeholders, projects prepare fact sheets, info videos. Of course, social media is very important, but every kind of cooperation or local events or workshops. So if you plan on doing starting a project, or if you heard about a project in your surrounding now, maybe during this event, or if you have a look on the NORA homepage and are interested in helping them, always get in touch with the projects. They're always very all of us are very happy if we can share our knowledge and share our love for the native oyster and its restoration. So altogether, to go back to these ocean decay challenges, oyster restoration and the knowledge transfer being done within those projects really meet the challenges too, for example, for protect and restore ecosystems and biodiversity. I mean, we heard a lot about that now, and it's really clear, but also to change humanity's relationship with the ocean, because you can only restore and save what you love, and you only love what you know. So I guess that's pretty much summarizing what this knowledge transfer is about. And it's really important to get everyone involved to see how important ecosystems like the native oyster reefs can be. And yeah, native oyster restoration brings us a big step forward, and I'm really looking forward to answer your questions or talk to you later within the discussion. And yeah, thank you for your attention.
Okay, great. Very good. Thank you both. Because we're a little bit delayed, I think I'm just gonna skip questions by now and move on to Marina, so we have time to do this like little activity that I have planned for the end. So Marina, are you ready?
Okay. Can you see this presentation?
Are you ready? Good to
yes,
go?
Can you see?
No.
No? Okay. Yeah. Let me 1 minute. Sorry. Yeah.
Ready. Perfect.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, it's not presentation mode though, Marina.
No.
Not yet.
Entonces me vuelvo al otro lado. Me vuelvo al otro lado. No se ve.
Sí, pero se ve raro. No sé por qué.
Vale. Ok. Vale. Sorry.
That happens live.
And now?
There we go. Perfect.
Okay. Okay. Marina Ventosa I'm a researcher from the Spanish Institute of Oceanography. My expertise is bivalve physiology, and since 2016, when the Mar Menor collapsed, I'm promoting, together with 8 scientists, one of them is our host in this webinar, Galimany, the Mar Menor Oyster Initiative. Well, I'm going to introduce you in this presentation the RemediOS project that is part of the initiative. And let me show you the Mar Menor. Where is it? It's in the southwest of Spain. It's one of the largest coastal lagoons in Europe. It has a semicircular shape and is separated from the Mediterranean Sea by a strip of sand of 23 kilometers called La Manga. The sandbar separates the lagoon and the Mediterranean Sea through 5 channels. And in the southern area, we have 5 islands of volcanic origin. The Mar Menor has an extension of 155 square kilometers, and the lagoon average is almost 4 meters. Bottoms are sandy in the shallow areas and moody in the deepest parts and it has a high organic content. The temperature in the lagoon can exceed 30 degrees and drop until 10 degrees in winter. And actually, the salinity of the lagoon is around 42, 44. The water renewal with the Mediterranean is around 1 year. The Mar Menor watershed is composed by the Campo de Cartagena plain that is dedicated to an intensive agriculture and a net of non-permanent water courses, except of the Albujon, that is continually flowing due to irrigation. Since 1979, there is a water transfer from Tajo to Segura River to irrigate the agriculture. Rainfall is highly variable and with very few intensive events, mainly in spring and in autumn. The Mar Menor has been always an oligotrophic lagoon with transparent waters with high salinity between 50, 53. And there was an important touristic development during the 60s of the last century. You can see in both pictures how the La Manga was transformed from a sandbar to a urban city. And in those years, sewage systems were very deficient and all urban wastewater ran to the Mar Menor. In 1973, the Estacio Channel was dredging in order to make navigable, and which caused the decrease of the salinity until 42, 48. In 1879, the Tajo Segura water transfer begins, and this supposed the transformation of the traditional rain-fed agriculture of Campo de Cartagena into intensive irrigation. The development of this agriculture causes the entry of nitrogen to the lagoon from the agricultural activities, and the area was declared susceptible to nitrate contaminations and being controlled by the European Nitrates Directive. During the 80s and 90s, dredging took place and artificial beaches were created as the Mar Menor becomes an attractive tourist destination. As the impacts of the Mar Menor increased, all kinds of protective figures were applied on the lagoon at global, European, and even regional level. And the decrease in the salinity of the Mar Menor supposed expansion of the algae Caulerpa prolifera that invades all the seabeds and threatens the angiosperm Cymodocea nodosa. In this time, some Mediterranean bivalves, as the pen shell and the flat oyster, colonized the lagoon. And we have been suffering since the 90s several jellyfish blooms. And in 2015, and especially in summer of 2016, a massive proliferation of phytoplankton was observed and transformed the water of the lagoon into a green soup that you can see in this picture. The most serious consequence of this turbidity was the death of all the vegetation of the lagoon in the deepest areas. The second mass mortality event was, in 2019, there was some floods that a big amount of water from the plain arrives to the lagoon, and the first anoxia mass mortality was observed in the lagoon. The second one, it was last summer in August, and it was also due to anoxia. The decrease in the salinity of the lagoon allowed the entry of the flat oyster, and in 1982, it was obtained a fishery of 80 tons of oysters, and the second, it was of 140 tons. However, the fishery was abandoned because the low quality of the oyster, as they were not attractive for consumption, as they developed thick shells. Also, it was very difficult to extract due to they were in the middle of the Caulerpa meadows and it was not easy to fish. The studies carried out in that time showed that the population achieved an amount of 155 million of oysters, and the last study was done in 26, and in that moment the population was reduced until 10 million of oysters. In this moment, we don't have any idea about how is the population, but sure that there are only some miles of oysters. Population reduction was related with the nature of the bottoms of the lagoon, also the incidence of the microalgae Caulerpa or the sponge Cliotosa, and also by the predation of the larvae predation by the jellyfishes. In 2018, the Bibarek meeting joined politics, environmental managers, and scientists to assess the use of bivalves in bioremediation actions in the Mar Menor. And scientists, that we were experts on bivalve physiology, estimate, based only in bibliographic data, a number of 16 million of oysters needed to have an effect on water clarity of the lagoon. So the Mar Menor Oyster Initiative was presented in November 2020 at the third conference of NORA, and the project was included in the NORA website, being the first and by the moment the only one project on oyster restoration in Spain. The Mar Menor Oyster Initiative aims to establish the physiological and technical basis for the use of the oyster, the flat oyster, in bioremediation actions in the Mar Menor in order to improve environmental status of the lagoon. We are thinking to work at 4 levels. The first one at scientific level. There are 2 different sections. The first one including the study of the current population status, and the other to study several physiological measurements to quantify how oysters feed in different water conditions, together with growth and maturity studies. All data will be incorporated into a model to predict the effects of flat oysters in increasing water quality in the Mar Menor. Given the actual situation of the lagoon, that we have almost no oyster, we need to support the action with seed produced in a hatchery. As Katrin and Corina mentioned, it's needed to work at level of education. So we are planning to construct some floating platforms in order to use for growing the seeds, also to conduct our physiological experiments and involve citizens in the different scientific studies. In the long term, the initiative will assess if oysters can provide any additional economic benefits as the use for human consumption or to obtain bioproducts. In the framework of the initiative, the RemediOS project has recently funded by the Biodiversity Foundation that belongs to the Spanish Ministry of Ecological Transition. The project is part of the PLEAMAR program that aims to support sustainable fisheries and aquaculture activities committed to the protection and conservation of biodiversity. RemediOS project is a proof of concept of the oyster seed production using local broodstock from the Mar Menor in order to assess the use of the fly oyster in nature-based solutions using the Mar Menor as a case of study. The project has emerged from science with the collaboration of the non-governmental organization ANSE and some journalists from TV and radio, and is funded mainly by the administration with some support provided by a private company. Here you have all the RemediOS team. Well, we focus in 3 points. The first one would be the hatchery, the second work with fishermen, and the dissemination work. We are building a small experimental hatchery to test the viability of the reproduction of the local oysters in order to obtain oyster seed that will be transferred to the Marshmallow ponds that it's in the southern part of the lagoon, where ANSE will grow out until they can be used for a future pilot study in the lagoon. The second working package is being the work with fishermen in order to retrieve information on the Menor oyster bed that it was described during the 80s and 90s. We will make a video and a report about that. We will make some workshops on the ecosystem services provided by the oysters. And we finally make a survey to the fishermen in order to ask for the interest in recovering the oyster beds and about what they think about this initiative. The last working package includes all the outreach activities with the objective to introduce society with the restoration practices. And we are going to work with local schools, high schools, and also university. And we give some talks in the Fundación ANSE facilities. We are participating in the IDEAS project that is introducing high school students to the research. And also we will do some experimental workshops about clearance rate measurements. All activities from this three working package are supported and advised by the NORA Alliance through the production working group that aims to exchange the experience about production of Australia adults for hatchery restoration purposes. And here we have Afif Da Costa, that is the member of the RemediOS project involved in this working package. And also Galimany, that is the responsible from the RemediOS team for the work in the outreach working group with all the dissemination activities that Katrin and Corina has told us. Finally, one of the main important goals of RemediOS, in line with what Hein says, it's to involve authorities and all the administrations that are taking care of the crisis of the Mar Menor, that are municipalities, regional and national government departments. And several meetings will be held with all of them in order to communicate NORA activities, oyster restoration examples, as we are doing today in this webinar, listen the oyster ecosystem system, and the RemediOS results. And at the end of RemediOS, a final event will be organized to discuss the RemediOS results with all the experts that we are here in this webinar, and maybe another one that maybe we can invite. And the main objective of this event is to encourage administrations and private companies to invest in oyster restoration in Spain, and not only in the Mar Menor, and to disseminate the message from the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. So I look forward to showing you all the results of the RemediOS projects in the coming months, and many thanks for your attention. And if you have any questions.
Good. There. Thank you so much, Marina. There's okay, in order to do my little final activity, well, Marina has some homework because there's a question for you in the question and answer chat box. So if you want to answer that, what I was gonna to propose was to get some sort of take-home message from everyone that's been speaking today. And now that we're experts in oysters and their wonders and everything they provide to the ecosystems and to us, I would like to encourage all of us, meaning also the audience, to join me. Let's see if I can make this happen. My turn to share screen. Over here. Okay. And if you could, I don't know if you see it. there has to be, oh, now is when I messed this up. Ah, there we go. There we go. Okay. If you can log in menti.com, you have the website up there. And here you have a code number. And so you will have the chance to add 2 keywords answering why is oyster restoration important. Does it make any sense? Are you logging in? I hope you all see this. So it's gonna log you in a website where you can be part of summing up what we've been talking about. So if you get in there, menti.com, there we go. See, and then your answers are gonna start showing up. Don't copy each other, please. And so with this, we're gonna have a beautiful word cloud. So the words that are gonna be more, written down are gonna show up with like bigger letters, and the ones that people don't write so much are gonna turn into smaller letters. And so with these, we can see what's the commonality? What do we all have more in mind of why is oyster restoration so important? We kind of have a winner already. Okay. We have 10 people only voting. Okay, isn't it fun to see how it changes? I think it's fun. Okay, let me see. We have more in the chat and question and answer. Perfect. Good. So there's a clear winner. Okay, so panelists, what do you think about this word cloud? Do we all agree on the wonders of oyster restoration could be summarized in biodiversity, maybe habitat and ecosystem services?
I think it's broader than that. I actually like the full breadth of it. I mean, I agree that those are really important. I'm not denying that, but
no, there are very good ideas here.
Yeah, but community, nitrate removal, these are really key as well.
Yeah, I like the economy because we usually forget the economy. I mean, at least me as a biologist forget the economical perspective of everything, of the investment, in oyster restoration. But then what do you get in return? That Boze talked about it.
Mm-hmm.
Do we stick to that? Keep moving though, huh?
If I may add something.
Yeah, sure, go ahead. I just don't see you, so I don't know if you want to talk.
Yes, okay. Well, 2 things. It's not only biodiversity, it's also bioproductivity. As Boze pointed out, it's not simply that these reefs are a habitat for a very diverse community, but in the sense of productivity, it is also very rich. There's just a lot more life on it. It's not just more diverse, but it's also in terms of biomass production per year, it is much bigger than, say, a sandy environment or just a rocky environment. The other thing I wanted to mention about the economy, the native oyster on the market is one of our most expensive shellfish. So the potentials, and that's big. I have been a culinary journalist too. And as I said, I like eating them. I also give tasting classes between various types of oysters. And the native oyster has a very special taste and structure, and that's why it's also very expensive. That means that the economic yield of combining, and that's possible, combining restoration with aquaculture is also potentially very big, much bigger than, for instance, mussels or something like that.
Why do you say it's bigger than mussel? Like, because of their costs, you mean?
Yeah,
like
well,
the profits?
Yeah, like the gross sale price cost of a native oyster is something like 50 cents a piece. Okay. The gross sale price of mussels is something like 50 cents per kilo.
Mm-hmm.
I'm shopping where you're shopping from now on.
Okay, I think it's interesting to see, right? That, I mean, most of us think that biodiversity is like our highest priority when thinking about oyster restoration. But there are all these other qualities that they have. I'm just gonna stop sharing. But
yeah, there's one outstanding question in the chat. And I think it's really valid, and it's a question about protection. And we always talk about restoration, but if we really want to talk about restoration, is just one part of recovery, and protection is the other really important part. And the question was, do oyster reefs today naturally deter damaging root fishing practices due to the potential to damage nets and gear, or do they need specific bylaws to stop people trawling the habitat? And the answer is they absolutely don't stop anything fishing over the top of them anymore. They're extremely sparsely distributed where they are found, even in areas which we deem to be quite dense these days. None of those sites have the qualities that Ruth was describing from the historical literature, and with the diesel engine, basically, and well, actually with the steam engine, even before the diesel engine, those habitats stopped developing their own protection. You know, initially they were protected for themselves, at least in the deeper waters, but yeah, no, absolutely now they require protection in order to recover.
You know, if it's nice to see that of all of us has concluded that biodiversity would be the first thing that we think about this. And for the Menor project, there are a lot of people that say that what we are promoting is to cover all the Menor with only one species. You know, it's like it's very important. Well, you know, if that we are working a lot in outreach, that it's like we have to repeat once and another time that really what we are doing is to increase in biodiversity, not to only to cover the sea with oysters. That some people that are very critics with the project, they think that what we try is only to put a lot of oysters in the sea, in the Menor. So.
Yeah, that's true. I think because in some areas this concept of restoration and bioremediation is still kind of unknown, and so that's why outreach and education is so important, right? To let people understand the whole concept and the whole package of what it means restoring. Even if it's restoring a species, it means, right, that you're creating habitat for many other species. They're gonna be like correlated with that. And we have a lot of proof, right? Like Boze showed it, right? Boze, we have a lot of proof that it works.
And by the way, also for Europe, we have this mixed oyster reef in the Dutch Delta, which is the Pacific oyster together with the flat oyster. And they facilitate each other, by the way. And I think I put already the link in the chat. There is an article by Christianen et al. And they show that facilitation, but it also showed that the biodiversity of the oyster reef, even compared to the sandy patches within the oyster reef, is twice as high. So also for Europe, we do have proof that oyster reefs in this case a mixed one, but that's not so important. Oyster reefs do improve biodiversity.
Yes, and also to add on that, we also see offshore, so where it's not as biodiverse as in coastal areas, normally even only the reef base, which is stone and layers of shells, and the first adults we put there, they're already after 1 year, we see an increase compared to the sandy patches beneath, like next to it. So it's really this three-dimensional system that this is still building on. I mean, that's just, we put one thing in and it's growing. And that's the great thing of nature, right? So we don't have to do a whole 3D reef. We just give the oyster its habitat back and they do it. And so that's really, yeah, that's really a great journey to be part of. Yeah.
Okay, Boze, were you going to add something? No. Okay.
There is a question on the Black Sea, actually, which is a really interesting one. There have been huge oyster reefs, flat oyster reefs in the Black Sea, and really not much that I know of at the moment. So there are a lot of questions, I think, about restoration in the Black Sea that would be worth addressing. But I don't have specific answers for that. We do need to run some kind of demonstrations.
I think we need to discuss the salinity, because again, there were oysters in the Baltic more extensively than there are today, and that's definitely a natural change as a result of salinity changes. And I suspect, I don't know very much about the Black Sea, but I suspect it's a similar story there. So the first thing, in terms of whether or not it's feasible, would be to check the salinity, because Edulis, unlike Crassostria, is, as Boze said earlier, not particularly tolerant of low salinities.
We need to expand NORA that direction a little bit, maybe.
Yes, I mean, I'd love. I don't know what the salinity is in the Black Sea, but I think, yeah, absolutely. Please bring up the conversation. I mean, I can't talk, but please share those informations, and we can certainly explore whether or not the baseline.
Yeah. Apart from some basic measurements, you can also do some limited pilots with gauges, etc. That's how we always start with restoration projects. Is we do a pilot to check whether the current circumstances are still suited for survival, growth and reproduction. And then if that is the case, you can go a step ahead. So you do it step by step. And of course, you can start with measuring the physical and chemical circumstances. That's a very important baseline. But then a next step is a few pilot field trials, and that way you go ahead. So if anybody is interested, we can show the kinds of steps you have to take.
Good, sounds great. Well, it's sadly time to end this workshop. So what I'm gonna do is share again and leave our contact information for anybody. Wait a second, there we go, here it is. For anyone who would like to get in touch with us, so here we are. These are the speakers of the day. If I can get this out of the way, there we go. And so with this ending, okay, wait a second, what am I doing?
We see it.
You say good?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, fine.
I can read my own name, so.
There we go. And your girlfriend Nora is there.
Yes.
Okay, so with this slide, even if I don't see your faces, but I know you all, so I would like to really thank you for this afternoon, for all your knowledge and your sharing and being so amazing at everything you're doing. So I hope the audience had a good time also. And for any further question, please get in touch. We're easy to talk to. So thank you, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eve.
Bye.
Thanks again for being present.
Thanks.